Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jen. I am the Recreation Director here in town on behalf of myself and Jen Miller, our Conservation Director, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. Again, thank you. We have Wayne here. He's our consultant. We've been working with him on this open space and rec plan for about a year now. He's from UMass. I'll let him introduce himself in a second, but just a little overview of how things will go tonight. We have a decent sized group, but I think it's manageable. We can all kind of talk together. We're here to get your feedback. Wayne has put together this plan that I think hopefully all of you have a copy of, and we're looking for feedback on the goals and action items specifically that are in this plan. We want your feedback. If there's something, totally off, or we missed something totally obvious, please let us know so that we can update this plan, because we want it to be as comprehensive and as accurate as possible, as this is a living document that will help guide projects for the next 10 years here in Westborough. So I think I've covered my part, and I'll let Wayne introduce himself and kind of add.
Yeah, better? Yeah. Okay. So Wayne Fiden, Director of Center for Resilient Metro Regions at UMass. We're basically, we're a UMass service unit. It's our job to help municipalities, mostly in Massachusetts, although throughout New England as well and other places as well. I've been involved with municipal planning for, I think, 40 years now. And so, the town asked us to help put together this plan. The state has a process for open space and recreation plans which we have to follow. If you don't follow that process, you're not eligible for state grants. But the state's requirements are procedural. So we have to look at accessibility. We have to look at various things. We have to enhance outreach for populations who are often left out. They don't get involved at all with the substantive part. This is a town plan, so any recommendations you want can be in the plan. Anything you don't want don't have to be in the plan. The state, as I say, doesn't get involved with that part of the process. As Jennifer said, we've been at this about a year now. We kicked it off with a public forum process last fall. We did a survey over the winter. We did a focus group for town boards. We did another public meeting this summer, and then this is the final public meeting. Some of the boards have met as well, conservation, recreation, have given guidance, so, and a disabilities committee. So we've been getting information from a lot of different places. My job is to put this all together, not to put my own personal feelings of what your priorities are. So listening to everybody, trying to find the ground, making recommendations, some which get kicked out and some which don't get kicked out. So the idea is this to be a town plan that's out there. I just want to step back a tiny bit for those of you who, I know you're all in different places. Some of you have been very involved in this planning process, some less so. So I apologize for people who know all this, but I want to make sure you understand what the point of the plan is in the first place. In Massachusetts, if you don't have an open space and recreation plan, you're not eligible for certain state grants. Land, which is the big grant the state gives for buying open space. Park, which is the big grant the state gives for preserving recreation areas. And then there's other state grants, which you're not required to have a plan for, but it sure helps. Mass trails, federal land and water conservation grants, there's other grants. So it's really important from a grant standpoint. By population, the vast majority of Massachusetts communities have an open space plan. By area, a lot don't. A lot of small towns never go through the process. So it's important for grants and it's important for planning, right? To help the town put things together. It's really easy for us all to live in boxes. Like you have an amazing conservation commission, amazing recreation commission, but they each have different goals. So the plans sort of help them, work together, and select board and, all the different players in town. And hopefully this is led by the planning effort, but we do keep both in mind. So you're going to see there's far more activities. So this is now a 10-year planning process. There's far more activities identified than you could possibly do in 10 years. And don't feel like you failed at the end of the 10 years, you didn't do all this. The problem is in Massachusetts, we never know when there's other grant funds available, right? So you can sort of predict how much money is there available from CPA and from town bonding, but you can't predict what's available from the state. You also can't always figure out the opportunities that come along, right? There's a piece of land which is great and you should buy, and the owner has no interest in selling, or that owner dies and their heirs want to sell immediately. And so we want to identify those things up front to keep those options open. So it's again, a planning document, but an optimistic planning document, if you will, in the process. So that's sort of the outcome. The state has, when I started this process not that many years ago, plans were good for 5 years. When we kicked off this process last fall, plans were good for 7 years. And then in March, the state revised the process and said, if you go through just a few more small hurdles, your plan will be good for 10 years. And that, of course, is worth doing because that saves the town money. You don't have to revise this plan for another 10 years now. So this will be a 10-year plan. Nothing stops the town from revising it. Nothing stops the town from coming back during the process and changing the priorities. If you're a glutton and want to go online and read the full 200-page plan, just know there's a couple of oddities you're going to notice in the language. Again, the state doesn't get involved with the substance, but they do get involved in the process. When you apply for grants, they want you to cite the plan in the grant application. And it's really useful in the grant application to say, here's the goals of the town that supports this acquisition, and then here's the actions that support this acquisition. So you're going to see some repetition. There is, as a planner, I'll defend this, there's reasons for this, right? It's easy, you're going to see tonight, I'm not going to go over every page of a 200-page plan. So we're going to talk about the big picture things where there's hopefully agreement, then the next step down, but obviously the plan goes in a lot more detail than that. The other than the last comment before I get into substance is, if you look at the plan, you're going to see a substantial amount of almost 100 pages, half the plan, are long appendices that you may not be interested in all, but we want to make sure, and the state wants us to make sure, we do a detailed assessment of accessibility. So we looked at every recreation area and every conservation area, and we went out and measured, where are the sidewalks steeper than 5%? Where are they steeper than 8.8%? There's various thresholds. And so we reported them. Again, you don't have an obligation to fix all those things, but we have an obligation to point that out. Some of those rose to the top. The Disabilities Committee reviewed these recommendations, and they are sort of supporting it. Obviously, they'd like you to fix everything you could possibly fix. That's not realistic anywhere. What this Commonwealth requires for communities with over 50 municipal employees, which obviously fits you, is that you have an ADA transition plan. And what ADA says is you're doing reasonable accommodation. You're taking reasonable steps. So conservation lands, most trails are not accessible now, and most trails will never be accessible, and that's fine. But you should have some trails that are accessible. Getting to most fields on steep slopes is never going to be fully accessible, but you should have some that are fully accessible. But if you have a bathroom, you are required to have another bathroom which is accessible. If you have a recreation facility, a community center, you're required for that to be accessible. So there's certain standards about doing it. The main rules for Americans with Disabilities Act and something else called Section 504 is that you're providing access to all programs, but not all facilities. So a program is walking. A program is forest bathing in the woods on a paved trail. A program is indoor swimming. If you had 2 community centers, both would not have to be accessible, but you only are going to have 1 indoor pool, so therefore it has to be accessible. If you had 10 lakes, they wouldn't all have to be accessible, but you only have 1 that has a good beach, so it does have to be accessible. So we tried to identify those things. What we identified in particular, and you'll see this if you go through this, is the low-hanging fruit. So let me use the beach as an example. You have a great paved trail that takes you almost to the water's edge. And then inexplicably it ends 20 feet before the water. And it happens to be a lot of sand there, and the sand blows. And so if you're in a wheelchair, you often couldn't cross over that. And then there's next to a shrubbery, and the shrubbery is growing onto the trail. So it sounds like a lot, but extending the paved trail maybe 40 feet, cutting back the shrubbery once a year, sweeping the pavement once a year, would suddenly bring a non-conforming place into conformance, as opposed to places where you could spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars regrading it. So we look at it. So that's sort of the big picture. What I want to do, and I don't want to spend most of the time listening to me, but I want to make sure you sort of understand this process. So I'm going to run through first the big picture goals. And please take notes. There's copies. If you don't have this, I'm on page 9 of this thing. This isn't actually the 9th page. This is page 9 of the, we excerpted from the plan. So again, I'm not going to go through this all, but we basically identified 5 goals, and we identified 10 top priorities. And I think at this sort of forum, we're probably not going to get deeper in the weeds than that in terms of my presenting, but I'm happy to comment anywhere you want. So the goals are the things which you should be thinking about that might cut across actions. Some of these goals affect recreation, some affect conservation, some affect zoning regulations. And so you want to think about those things. You want all the different parts of municipal government to work together. So none of them are surprise, incidentally. These are not going to be earth-shattering. But protect and conserve your land resources for open space and recreation. You have to decide how much that you want. Certainly we heard from advocates. We heard from advocates for open space from both land trusts and the Conservation Commission who want to protect more land. We heard advocates for recreation who were a little less focused on needing more land for recreation, but more focused on needing more recreation facilities. Obviously, the community center being the big thing these days, the dog park that was just done, but sort of thinking about those. So that's the big picture, and this includes everything from how do you fund it to, what are the actions that you take? So that's sort of the big picture goal. Second one reflects what I just said, improve accessibility, right? You need to do some things to keep in compliance with the ADA, and at least my recommendation for priorities, because I did the first draft of the recommendations, is do the things that are cheap and easy to do right now, right? Do those, a lot of those you could do with existing forces without new resources. Although there's a state gives a grant for ADA compliance, so you could do some of those things. And again, we go through what those mean, but we're trying to cover all different populations, right? People with mobility impairments are just as diverse as the rest of everybody else, right? So my 98-year-old mother has since died, but there was a period she was not in a wheelchair, but she couldn't walk more than 100 feet before she had to sit down, right? That's one kind of accessibility. And then she couldn't stand up unless there were arms for her to stand up on, right? Whereas there, people who were in auto accidents when they were 20, whose muscles are the size of my arm muscles, the size of my legs, and they can take a wheelchair up really steep slopes, and they want to go into more wilderness areas. So we want to think about all those different kinds of experiences that are out there. But there's trade-offs, just to be clear. I did a project for a library in Leverett, and the disability community, which is tiny, Leverett's a very small town, some people wanted forest bathing. They wanted to be as close in the wilderness as they could get. This is only a third of a mile trail, but they wanted to be as close to the wilderness as they could get. And others wanted handrails. And so even within that same community, you had a diversity. You're going to have the same thing at a larger scale that's out here. Third is promote and encourage environmental awareness. This is an environmental education program. Some things you can guess like this are going to be much more focused on your partners, right? Partners at Sudbury, partners at the Westborough Land Trust, maybe at your schools, maybe it's wayfinding signs. Wayfinding signs might be a town effort, but just build awareness that's out there. Your area is actually in pretty good shape. I've been in a lot of places where you see trash and debris and abuse. Yours are pretty well loved, but that doesn't mean that it's not ever bad behavior that you want to think about. The trail connectivity, this is everything from, the bee wall to all the other trails, the necklace, the shorter trails, what are the ways to do this? And the connectivity in particular. So, and I think you're one of the leaders in the state in looking at not just individual trails that go nowhere, but how do you tie them all together? The thing which is not an open space and recreation thing, but we still want to think about is, how does this connect to the street grid, right? If I'm a kid leaving high school and want to walk to Veterans Field, are the memorial field, are the sidewalks in good shape? So connectivity comes, in all shapes. Improve recreation offerings is pretty obvious, and obviously you're really focused on the community center now. There may be other things. We heard about the need for tot lots. Like early on in the process, we heard someone saying we need tot lots in environmental justice areas where people are often underserved. And then I forgot, it was a comment we received or at the meeting, somebody said, no, not just environmental justice areas. It should be everywhere. So those kinds of things is always a trade-off. Tot lots are great, but of course, when you distribute recreation resources, they can be actually harder to maintain, right? Having one big recreation area is easier for a crew to go than 10 around town. And we don't really opine on that. We opine saying you need to figure out how to do a better job of maintenance. But some things are going to be difficult for doing it. We do talk, and particularly about accessibility. Some of the accessibility challenges are places where there are maintenance challenges, right? A big crack in a sidewalk that makes an entire accessible area not accessible. So that's the big picture goals. I'm going to go through just sort of their top 10 priorities and explain what the difference is. But any big comments jump out at anybody? Okay. Any big comments? Yeah. Yes. You'll be Dana?
I can be the mic person. Did you have a comment? Oh, just, oh, okay. Westborough TV is filming, so that's why we just use the mic.
Okay. I wasn't at the last meeting, and I think you mentioned that there were lots of comments made at the last meeting that might not be reflected in this summary. Are you able to go over those, or has any progress been made in addressing any of those at this time?
There weren't a lot. There are, and I'm going to apologize up front, the pond that I always mispronounce, Hockomock Pond. So people said, the reuse committee is disbanded, given hazardous materials, nothing is going to happen within the 10-year planning horizon of this. So we dropped that reference. It still remains acknowledging that there are great blue heron that are there, like people shouldn't go there, but wildlife is going to use it. So it's there. Forever is a long time, but in the next 10 years, it's not there. So we dropped that piece. Do you remember the other ones?
That was the biggest takeaway. And then there was some more comments. It was a little bit of a smaller group, and Wayne wasn't with us, so we sat sort of informally, and people just gave comments on the goals and the action items. But it was just more about things that people might want to see. We talked a lot, a good 10 minutes about a community garden, teen playgrounds. So the biggest outcome of that was the Hockomock Pond, and we removed that from the plan.
The other ones and we also heard comments from the Conservation Commission, so I can't remember whether it's from that forum or from the commission, but the thing I just mentioned about tot lots, don't just focus on tot lots in priority areas, but think about tot lots everywhere. And then there was some minor tinkering, didn't change the goals at all. When we get onto the priorities that we're doing next, there was minor tinkering in this should be moved up in the process.
As the guy who created the two trail networks, or proposed trail networks in town, I'm a little disturbed because we seem to have lost a lot of history. 20 years ago, the town WCLT and the town both decided that the Charm Bracelet was no longer a loop. It was actually supposed to be a network of trails, and we actually have plans for a network of trails that would be 80 miles of trails in town. At one point, we had roughly 60, assuming Fish and Wildlife, but some of which now since Fish and Wildlife is trying to get rid of all their trails, as a problem. The second one on that is Jim Robbins, the former town planner, and I spent 3 years working on the Burroughs Loop Trail. And one of the things that came out of the Burroughs Loop Trail and has been promptly forgotten because CMRPC by that point was no longer particularly active, and MAPC didn't give a damn about it because it was all in CMRPC's territory, was the idea of the Burroughs Loop 2, which was an expanded loop, since in Westborough we have a mile of the Burroughs Loop Trail and Northborough has about 3 miles of the Burroughs Loop Trail. And for a 33-mile trail, that was supposed to be equal for the 4 communities. That didn't seem to be particularly fair to us. And we did come up with a plan that would have actually extended the trail with a little bit of a sideway into Shrewsbury, and somehow the town of Westborough no longer even seems to remember that that was on our plans at one point. The other comment I'll make is unfortunately they're saying accelerate. I see points in here about accelerate acquiring easements and other things for stuff. One of the problems WCLT has had is, since the town, most of the easements we need for the charm bracelet either involve land that's going to be developed by the town, and the town has changed its policy. It used to be when a developer came and said they wanted the plan, when they were getting the concept plan approved, one of the things was that they'd agreed to give WCLT an easement. Now they're saying you will give WCLT an easement, or give the town an easement, within a year or two of the completion of the project, which puts things out another 8 to 10 years, and a lot of the reason for our stopping. The other one is that we have about 12 easements we need that coexist with the BWALT. And since they slowed down the BWALT easement effort, and actually made it, and have in some cases made what was supposed to be a nice wide easement that would have been good for everybody, a narrow easement. Basically, between those two things, the ability for WCLT to acquire easements to complete the charm bracelet are essentially completely stymied. At the same time, the town has ripped out more than one place the trail without notifying the landowner or the trail owner before the trail was ripped out.
Thank you. So, again, the fourth goal is about trail connectivity. When we get to priorities, I'll go through those and probably come back to some of Don's comments at that point. Was there another hand over here? Okay, so let me walk you through the next part, and then again, we want to do more of a sort of workshop format. But the next part is the 10 top priorities. And here you're getting a little bit of planner east so you understand how this came. So we identified those 5 goals. They're high-level goals, the best thing we could find for consensus, right? So I know in some places BWALT's controversial, but at least trail connectivity didn't seem to be controversial. So we were trying to figure out the things that people seem to agree. Someone told me years ago, we have 5 fingers, we should only have 5 big ideas. So the idea of those goals is those are the 5 big goals for the next 10 years. The priorities are, the state asks us to do priorities because they want to make sure you're not saying, we're going to say everything's really important. Everything's the most important thing. And then you apply for grants because that's the thing that can come along. So they really want to force you to think about, what are your priorities for actions? This we did tinker with after the last forum because people have different priorities for actions. Again, I started these thinking about what made sense, but it's not my place to tell you your priorities. So the priorities may be the thing that's most important for me. After I'm done talking, we sort of break into workshop format for you to go line by line, and say, here's the priorities we should add. We already include the BWALT and the necklace and the trail priorities, but not the boroughs. Hearing Don's comment, maybe we should call out the boroughs as one of the priorities. So that's the kind of thing I hope to hear from you at that point. But of course, because priorities cross-cut, when you look at the table, it looks a little confusing. You're going to see sometimes a goal that's the first priority, and that same goal shows up at the fifth priority. Because we, in essence, we put these by priority, and then we said, which goal does it go with? That makes sense. Because most times you're not going to read them both. So, and then it's easy to say we want to do everything, and it's easy to have a shopping list. I've already told you there's more things you can possibly do in 10 years, but that shouldn't be an excuse. So setting a priority, setting specific years that would be nice to do the work, that might not happen. No one's going to beat you up if it doesn't happen. But it's an exercise to get you to think about what should happen when, and then one of the columns in this table is who should be responsible. And in a town like this, there are 50 million people responsible for everything. So when I say responsible, what I'm really meaning is the convener. Who should knock on the door and beat up people and say, come to this meeting, let's start the process. It's not that any one person or any one office is going to deliver everything. Those of you around municipal government know this. It takes an incredible consensus for anything to happen. It doesn't take a lot of consensus to kill projects. So having someone who's responsible for this is important. I managed a planning office for 30 years, and I used to be planning director in Northampton. And my goal was always to assign people specific tasks, and their performance evaluation was based on how well they did the task. This isn't like a legal performance evaluation, but I would hope that if the Conservation Commission is responsible for a task and accepts it, that they put an agenda once a month to say, how are we doing on this task? They obviously don't have to accept the task. So, all right, so with that in mind, let me do this. So the first priority, and you're going to see a bunch of these things are together, because we want to do this all within 10 priorities, right? You have 10 fingers and 2 hands. But you can do some things simultaneously. So in terms of recreation, the recreation director is the one who's going to be the most responsible for recreation things. But of course, if she doesn't have the town manager's support, and the town manager doesn't have select board support, and select board doesn't have town meeting support, these don't go anywhere. So they all come together, but who's the one you call up to say what's happening is on here. So, the community center has made incredible progress even since the last time I was here, and I know it's in the plan to do more. So clearly that's important. Opportunities for programming. So, one thing is facilities, and the other thing is for programming, and recreation does both. And then community gardens. We heard, actually, it was a surprise. That's one of the things that moved up during the public process. We heard people going, I think not the July one, but one of our earlier meetings. So those are sort of the top priorities for actions. At the same time, protecting the land base for open space and recreation is incredibly important. And even though they're ranked order, it doesn't mean you're not working on both things simultaneously. The conservation director and the open space committee are going to be the responsible parties for the town. You have 2 very active land trusts and multiple state agencies who are going to lead on many of those things, particularly who's from Sudbury here? Is someone from Sudbury Land Trust? Right. Oh, okay. Sudbury is incredibly active. Westborough is, but they're a regional land trust. You'd expect that. Not beating you up, but you expect that. Westborough Land Trust is amazing to me. You don't usually see groups that are that active at the municipal level. So you're blessed by having these 2 incredibly active land trusts that are out there. But of course, you can't set their priorities, and they're trying to find their own funding for the process. So, thinking about open space acquisitions, what you're seeing in the map here is parcels of land that are privately owned, state-owned, or municipally owned that are not permanently protected. So in Massachusetts, once town meeting or the select board says, this is open space or this is recreation, it's protected forever by Article 97 of the amendments to the Massachusetts Constitution. I mean, nothing's forever. 2/3 vote, roll call vote of the state legislature, support of select board, but it's as close to forever as it can be. If you buy land with CPA money, you also put a restriction on it so you're even doubly protected. But if the town just owns land for general purposes, it's not protected. It could be sold. So the town should be looking at that process. Exactly the same thing applies to the state. land the state owns that's in DCAM, Department of Capital Asset Management Maintenance, is not protected. Land that's part of a park is. So looking at all those resources, prioritizing them, thinking about which ones should you be going forward on in the process. I can't remember if I put this somewhere else, but you have some land, not a lot, what's called chapter land. It's the land's being protected right now for recreation, forestry, or agriculture. And in return, the property owner gets reduced taxes, but anytime they want, they can sell it. They have to pay back some portion of the back taxes, and the town has a right of first refusal, which they can assign to somebody else. So it's, and I can't remember if that might repeat somewhere else, but it's worth looking at that land because that right of first refusal is a relatively short time period. So you're going to see later on, should the town be working on memorandums of agreement with the land trust, just as one approach, that says if one of these property, I mean, right now you guys play really well in the sandbox and these things work. But the more work you can do up front and spell those things out, right? Here's what we would do if we had an inquiry. Because raising a lot of money in a short time period can be a challenge. So that's the kind of planning that's out there. Third priority is, again, all we've talked about before in terms of improved accessibility. Fourth priority is preserve your existing land. I'm sorry, that's where I put the MOUs in. So, you know, the town doesn't have a huge labor force to maintain conservation areas. It relies on volunteers, which is great at the land trust. But you know, should that process be formalized? Once a year, should the town sit down with Sudbury? Once a year, should they sit down with Westborough? Once a year, should they sit down with DCR? And just, you know, spell those things out. And this is as much as anything else to prevent, you know, confusions. But also, I'm assuming people here may overrepresent people who know who owns what. My guess is most community members could care less whose property they're on. They're on town property, it goes onto Westborough, it goes onto Sudbury, it goes onto state land. They don't really care. So even thinking about, should there be naming conventions so that, you know, it's a clear message. I don't care, but that's the kind of thing that often comes up in these meetings. Again, this is not to imply that everyone's not talking to each other. The process works really well. It's just formalizing has some benefits of sort of thinking of this. So the fourth one is what Don was talking about is, you know, improved trail connectivity. Think about the bee wall, think about the charm bracelet, think about individual trails. I guess think about the Burroughs Trail, which is not on here. You know, what are ways to improve those things? As I say, that's the thing that really stands out, is this connectivity. I mentioned I worked in Northampton. We came up with this idea when we had a lot of trails. Northampton's a huge amount of trails. And we came up with saying we want to loop them all together in a loop that circles the entire city that's 26 miles long. And it was really interesting to me how it got people excited. Very few people are going to walk the whole 26 miles, but they could suddenly visualize it connecting. It became actually a priority for some of the land acquisitions to fill in some of the gaps. Don was talking about easements, but acquisitions do that as well. So just sort of thinking about that connectivity in different ways, and tell us more detail when we sit down. Next part, sixth priority, again, only 10, so we're almost there, is how do you manage these properties? I won't go into detail, but I will say in my 40-year career, I think we've done a better job in New England than ever before about preserving land and thinking about active management, and we are losing ground every single year for invasive species. And that rate of loss to invasive species is speeding up with climate change.
Being on the Conservation Commission, the biggest problem we have with conservation offices, we have Andy Kenningsburg, 3 Smith Street, on the Conservation Commission. The biggest problem that we have with the hundreds of acres of conservation property is that we have to depend upon the good graces of WCLT to maintain trails and point out issues. There's no budget for maintaining these lands. There's no staff to maintain these lands, do what's necessary. And that's a problem. That's a problem that I wish we could address as a town, but budgets are tight. But this is something I feel we need to do. Otherwise, as you're talking about invasive species, the land deteriorates.
And of course, I mean, those are the kind of things I think we're trying to highlight to think about without necessarily solving them. But, and there's different solutions. I mean, some towns do fund that kind of work. That may or may not be the right solution. Some towns, in my community, we've done a lot of work on sort of, because we don't have a group, a sort of volunteer group, we've done a lot of work trying to create them, doing adopted trail. You're sort of blessed for the most part that you have volunteers, that you have formal partners, but that also in some ways lets you off the hook. They're taking care of those set things. So, times it's worth just thinking about what is the process? What do you expect for volunteers? What are the standards? I've done work with volunteers who are, I'll tell you one story. Again, this is from Northampton. Sorry to talk about Northampton as much, but we had volunteers who were mountain bikers, and we love the mountain bikers. They're great. They did a lot of trail work. But one day on their own, without asking anybody, they decided to take a leaf blower to blow the leaves off the trail so the mountain bikes wouldn't slip. And suddenly all the people walking who had loved the mountain bikers and gotten along, suddenly it created a new point of stress. And then, we got them together and they talk together, now they hold hands all the time. But we want to think about how do we get those things so we don't have those problems up front. So, a whole range of things here. I won't go through these, but just sort of thinking about those kind of things. And then the next, and this is still priority, what are we up to? Oh, there's 2 6s. I don't know how to count. The second priority 6, I will correct that in the final version, is look at your regulatory system, right? You have some really good regulations that are encouraging open space, but maybe it needs tweaking. What's the timing for where open space gets protected? What's the cross easement system to make sure that no matter who changes their mind, you've protected the land? If I was a property owner, I don't know your frontage requirements, but I'll just give you one example. Let's say you're in a district, again, I'm making up these numbers because I don't know, where there's 100-foot frontage requirement. If I had exactly 100 feet and someone came along and said, would you let me have an easement through your property to get to the open space behind it? Well, maybe I'd give them an easement. Probably protected by the recreation liability statute, which protects you from liability. But some property owners' attorneys will say, don't take easements. All the recreation liability statute does is protect you if it goes to court. You don't want to go to court in the first place. So some landowners said, I'd rather give you the land. I'd rather give you a 10-foot strip. The landowner can't give you the land because then their land wouldn't comply. So some towns have a provision where if you give the town land for open space, which they want, you get credit for it for zoning purposes forever. Okay. The reason that's only one of lots of techniques. The reason I highlight is you guys already have a lot of the normal basket of tools that communities do. That's the one gap that I saw that you don't have that some communities have. So sort of thinking about the regulatory part of the piece. Then the next one, the 7, is sort of going back to your point, how do you protect and conserve land, the management, right? Within the town, who's responsible for what in the process? Do you explore new funding? I'm sorry, I did say this out of order. The time-critical bridge financing is what I was just talking about now. Like, I'm working in Western Mass and part of a consortium trying to protect thousands of acres of land. And Mass Audubon put together, I think it was some multi-million-dollar project. This isn't just in Western Mass, but it's really helping us. Mass Audubon serving as bridge financing, moving deals forward, and they need the money back at some point. They're not there forever. I bought some land with the trustees as a partner. I bought land with Mass Audubon. So often those partners, sometimes the partners are in it for the long run, right? They're putting money in, Sudbury buys land forever, right? But sometimes the partners, like I use Mass Audubon because I've worked with them most. If you're next to a sanctuary, they want to buy the land, they may be landholders forever. If you're not next to the sanctuary, they often are willing to put money in. Maybe they're going to be in for 5 years, but they want to have an escape plan. How does it come out when a landscape partnership grant comes through or some other funding piece? So those are the things we want to think about up front. You guys have Community Preservation Act. I know increasing taxes is always controversial, but because there's a state match, it's one of the taxes that's more desirable in some communities to increase the percent. You're allowed to go up to 3% maximum. And then one of the ones that was Somebody advocated against at the last forum is exploring selling carbon tax, or carbon credits, right? So you can imagine communities that want to be carbon neutral need to show that they're offsetting the diesel they use for their fire trucks. And so you can sell carbon credits. It is a nightmare to do. You would never be in the lead for it. But their partners who'd work with you. Mass Audubon did a major consolidation of their properties a few years ago and sold carbon credits. The idea is we're going to preserve this land forever. It's going to hold carbon. Let's sell it. You know, every time you fly in a plane, there's a little checkbox that says, do you want to pay an offset for your flight? That's the kind of funding that goes into these things. And so there is a market. Again, it's very complicated, but potentially there's partners with it. So I just said, I didn't ditch it. I'm happy to if people tell me to. But in return for the comment, I said, this is hard. You need to find a partner. You couldn't do it on your own. We're almost done. So 8 is recreation trails, and then some specific things about this is where pocket parks are. This is where looking at Veterans Freedom Park is. So specific recreation areas, thinking about the golf club and opportunities there to expand it. ADA, again, this is now priority. Okay, so that's why the extra number. So that's the one we moved up. I didn't get rid of the old one. So ADA is in here, but it shows up twice. I'll get rid of that in the final one. And then reduce nutrient loading for Lake Chauncey, right? That's not a traditional conservation land, but the lake has some water quality challenges that might be getting worse. How do you address them? We know that harvesting weeds is basically a waste of time and doesn't do much good. You need to get it at the source. So what are the opportunities for doing this? So you raising your hand? Oh, okay. Any big picture comments for this?
So one of the things that caught my attention when I looked at the plan was where the nutrient loading at Lake Chauncey ended up for priorities, and the fact that it looked like it wasn't going to get touched until 2030 in the plan. And I know there are Cub Scout troops, Boy Scout troops that have been trying to use the water there, and they can't because right now if you fall in and you drink, you could have massive issues because it isn't just nutrient loading. The result is that we have poison in our water, basically. It's from the cyanobacteria. And so I see a lot of other goals on here where we're trying to make a new open space or improve some area for something when we have an area which, frankly, for half of its usable time during the year, it's completely unsafe. We can't boat on it, we can't swim in it, and it's our town beach. That's an area where you teach kids how to swim so they don't drown when they're older. This is a life skill area. It's a very important space. We have very green soccer fields, very wonderful baseball fields, and a poisonous pond. And I'd really love it to move up in the list, probably somewhere near 3 or somewhere between 3 and 6 as a priority. I don't know if other people realize that it's that big of a problem, but it really is. Thank you.
Thank you. Just so you know, because I'm not ignoring comments, I want to go through now and sort of big picture comments, and then I'm going to ask you all to come around the table, and we'll do an exercise. You guys don't necessarily get to decide, but we'll go through and say, if you were prioritizing these, what are the changes you'd make? I'm looking to the extent possible for the consensus of this group. Again, other people in town get to make the final decision, but I want to weigh those things in. So other big comments, yeah?
I guess I was surprised to see that the new community gardens, there is community gardens over at St. Luke's Cemetery in the back, and every time I go by, it's smaller and smaller and smaller, and you don't have enough people filling it up, so why do you need new ones?
Oh, yeah, no, that's great feedback. At the July meeting, I actually said, I had gotten similar feedback years ago from a resident about that we didn't necessarily need another community garden. There was one at St. Luke's that's open to the public, and I brought that up at the last meeting, and it was kind of a resounding, well, the 3, 4, 5 people that were there had said that that was incorrect, that it's, we could use another one. St. Luke's isn't always as accessible as it could be, or what, I don't remember the specific reasons, but it was the opposite kind of take on it. So appreciate the feedback.
And I can't remember, but I'll certainly check. We did the survey, which was the outreach we did that had the greatest response rate. So I tend to like using those numbers, but I just don't remember offhand, frankly, without looking, whether community gardens showed up or not. I don't want to represent it one way or another, but we're certainly, that's the first thing I'll do tonight when I get back home, is understand that. Other,
Community gardens. I don't know if I'm going to repeat what you said, Jen, but I mean, they're kind of hidden back there, and you got to get in a car to go there. Were people saying they wanted them more like in the center of town? Is that where that was coming from?
Yeah, more not even the center of town, just more accessible, or people might, I'm paraphrasing, but where it's at St. Luke's, people might not be as comfortable using that space. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you. Like I said, a few years ago, that was the exact response I had. Oh, there's one at St. Luke's that's open, so. Yeah.
okay. Other comments? Okay, I don't know how well this is going to work for cable, but can I bring people in around here around the table, and I'd just, bring the sheet with you, and I'd love just to do this as an exercise, let's get deeper in the weeds. Which priorities do you like? Which priorities do you not like in the process? And we want to make sure we get you out in time, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but maybe we spend 15 minutes on this. And then one last chance for open comments, and then let you all go home. Memorandum of understanding. Yep. Yep. And so there's often compromises you can think about. So let me think about community gardens. Again, I'm not involved in this process, but what's forever is landmark. So one approach is identify a hayfield in the right place that could be used for community gardens if needed if St. Louis closed, but not actually necessarily developing and bringing water to moving across. Okay, does anybody else see opposites? So again, I don't want to spend time talking, so I'm just going to go through each one and give me input. For the priority one, are there other things you don't like there? And then as we get further down, I say there's so in one, we've already heard about community gardens. Are there other ones that are questionable?
I have a question about understanding. It says complete community center, recreation, and trails. I understand we can do recreation there. What is trails in the community center?
Yes, I was wondering that too.
So complete the community center means, fit out the bottom portion of the building for the senior center, do any of the renovations upstairs in the rec department. That's what that means, to fit out the community center. Right, but that's anticipated to, the library is due to move out within a year or so, and this is a 10-year document, as Wayne had mentioned, so that's why it's included in here. And it's a, okay. Yeah, this is why we're here, so that's, yeah, it's good feedback. It's not, there's nothing set in stone either. This is still a working document that will be edited, so nothing, I just want to make sure for people at home, or nothing has been set anywhere in stone that this has to be done by a certain date, or anything printed in here is final. So I just, yeah, so the fit out, as far as the pool goes, the pool is, we're rebidding the pool right now as we speak. It's out to bid. Bids will come in the first week in October. Myself, Christy, the select board will decide, given the prices that we get, if we're able to do that as a standalone project. If we're not able to do that, given the price, it would become part of the fit out of our second floor, the community center.
So you see what this plan will be is, so this, what I'm hearing is we would still keep 2025 because active work is going on now, right? Going to bids as part. So these aren't necessarily bricks and mortar. This includes the active work. But in terms of the library piece, certainly you'd have to add an additional green for at least another year to get there in the process.
I'm just saying, I would prefer we fix what's causing the issue with the water and the trees and land around that, because we're probably managing the environment, and as long as we keep procrastinating doing something, we're probably making that worse. We've lived for hundreds of years without a pool inside, so I think we can be doing that.
All right, let's keep going through. When we get to the lake, let's talk about those things. All right, so protect land generally was the second ranking. Any comments on this one?
I would add better coordination with other land protection organizations in the area.
Okay.
The town, the WCLT was working on protecting 120 acres in 3 purchases, 2 of which were going to, should have been done with or completed by now. And the town went in and not only didn't know what they were doing, so therefore actually destroyed the work. In the third case, basically the landowner, who was a Chapter 61 landowner, has said that he's changed his will such that the first thing that when he dies is they take the land out of 61 so the town can never get it. And it's one of the town's priority pieces of land.
Thanks.
I am the head of land preservation for WCLT, by the way.
All right, so third one, I do realize why the ADA shut up twice. I separated out by the high priority, low hanging fruit, and that's the one that was listed as the third item. And then the things that you'll be working on for the next 100 years are close to the bottom. So this first one then is those high priority actions, all relatively inexpensive. Many could be done in-house. And sometimes it just takes a focus on those things.
Can I pick up on what Don said? I think what he's saying is there should be another bullet here about coordinating.
Yep.
Okay, you got
I got it, yeah.
The town is at present, I count, there's another situation with Sudbury Valley trustees where they're assuming that SVT will take a piece of it.
WCLT are the 2 here in town.
And who's that last part, Don? Tony Schiavone, you said they're the trustees you mentioned.
Basically, they're assuming that the SVT would acquire a piece of land, and I know SVT does not want to acquire that piece and would prefer the town to, and so we may lose that land.
Okay, thank you.
Basically, the the town's coordination, does not coordinate with any other group and comes back and tells us after the fact. Same with trail development.
All right. List the specific groups that you want to increase coordination with?
I would say at least Sudbury Valley Trustees, New England Forestry Foundation, Southborough Open Land Foundation, and Westborough Community Land Trust, the 4 land trusts that are in town right now. And there has been things in the past by both trustees and Mass Audubon that looked at land possibly in Westborough, but never acquired any, so.
So this fits the next one. So what I have as the 4th priority is annual meetings and MOUs for land management and land acquisition partners. So that's sort of a freestanding one. So I agree totally with what Don's saying. I don't know if you even, this is a fine point, it doesn't matter, if it's a subcategory or if it's important enough to say, this is important, it should be its own category that's out there. Memorandum of Understanding. It's basically just an agreement. You know, generally not, I mean, you can make them as a legal contract or informal, but it's to spell those things out, right? Usually when communications break down, frankly, it's on everybody's part. I don't know the details here, and so I can't vote, but usually the best way to do this is just to sit down and have a face-to-face meeting and spell those things out. And whether it's a series of bilateral MOUs or a, sorry, what's 5? 5, synclateral, I'm not sure what the right term would be, you know, with all the partners, it doesn't really matter.
Again, I'll designate, for the last 10 years through 4 conservation agents now, we've been promised that we would put together a new MOU for managing the trails in town. And it has been put off through 4 different agents, including the fact that we need to have a policy for OPDMD, which most people don't know what that means, but it's other powered mobility devices. In other words, it's related to ADA and allowing people to get out into the woods. The town has started to write its own trail easements, and the one I just saw violates the federal laws on OPDMD, the 2 that they finally produced.
So I hear you. One of the joys for me about planning is it's forward-looking. I don't really care about the history. So right now, and change the order. Yeah, I get it. So right now, we're showing this as the 4th top priority. So argue to raise the profile if you want, but yes, you should have an MOU, you should have a formal meeting, you know, should break bread together.
With the Conservation Commission, but we need, after 15 years, we know that it's getting old and there's things that should
Yep.
be improved for both parties.
Okay, good.
Don, what you're saying is you would like to move this up on our list and make it higher.
Yeah, I mean, it's been promised since 2015 to town managers and 4 conservation agents. I consider that a pretty long, bad situation.
So, you know, the nature of priority setting, of course, is it's forced choice. So it's easy to move up. Which items do you want to then move down?
I'm just saying that a lot of the things that you want to do here, including protect and conserve land, resources, and stuff like that, if you don't have coordination, you're going to have more problems.
Yeah.
And
So
I've been in discussion with some of those organizations about potentially suing the town.
this may be moot because all 5 first priority actions all suggest starting in 2025. So the priorities may matter less, but it's still an exercise to think about for doing it. You know, what gives if you move something up, I guess is the question. All right, so those 5, as I say, are sort of all the same time. Some are shorter term, some are longer term, but all should be starting. And these sort of fit together because that coordination, so it doesn't really matter if they're separate items or not, because if you're buying land, you need to meet with your partners. And so having that stuff all at the same time, lets it go. It's not like you need 5 different meetings, I guess I'm saying. This process begins and going forward. Okay, I mean, you could, one that's not land is the accessibility. But again, frankly, you've left some low-hanging, really easy fruit on the table. And so that's the reason we suggested as being third priority, just to send a message that this population shouldn't be left out. So any other comments on those first 5 collectively, the ones that should start this year? And again, I do want to say, we started this plan, got to a draft plan May or June. So, I'm fully aware there's not that much left of 2025, but, at least you start thinking about the things.
There's all kinds of spaces in town. I mean, is there something legally they wouldn't allow them to do? I noticed there's a person out here gardening in my garage that
No, and that's why all it's on here is explore options. So those things you're talking about are perfect options, as opposed to saying, here's the right place for doing it. I wouldn't be qualified to say that. All right, so the next priority is all those things about open space amenities, environmental awareness, a whole range of things. Some of these, again, would come out of an MOU, but they're going to be somewhat lower priority. One possibility is to move up, dealing with nutrient management at Lake Chauncey, there's a few ways to approach this. One is there's years of planning and grant writing to go forward, which is why we list it as a separate item, thinking there's probably a major capital investment going forward. But there's also a lot of discussions and explorations and planning necessary. So one way to do this is to divide it up, to say in this category of all these things that are improving recreation, open space, amenities, we should start be thinking about what do we do for Lake Chauncey? Chauncey, which is different than saying, if what comes out of that process, and I'm making this up, I'm not trying to start any rumors, that you need some major focus on sewage disposal. That's a much longer term piece. So does that address people sort of the different priorities of moving it up from a planning standpoint with everything else here? I mean, that's what consensus building is all about,
I can honestly say, in this case, in defense of the town, we don't know if it's our fields, the ag fields that are on Fish and Wildlife that lease to a farmer, even the old, very large septic field that's from the state hospital that's back a little ways, but still drains into the Chauncey watershed.
Yep.
All of those could be, any one of those could be the primary.
Right. That's why you want to do that part of process early on. I mean, that's why I personally hate seeing those weed harvesters. They're a Band-Aid that do almost no good for beyond the weeks that they're out there. So I want to think about, what are those fundamental solutions usually. All right. So unless I hear otherwise, yep.
You obviously have goal 1, split it up.
Yep.
Bullet points. Why can't that just be moved up to the second 10 priority? It's the same premise, isn't it?
Which one? I'm sorry.
So we're talking about Lake Chauncey.
Yep.
Everybody's in agreement that
Yep.
obviously that should devote some more time, energy, and resources.
Yep.
Why can't it be put back up into that? If it's still goal number 1, right? Why can't that bullet point be slid back into?
It certainly can. At some point it becomes a fake exercise, right? Yeah.
As Wayne pointed out, I'll make, since I'm on a board of a watershed and water protection for the estimate, actually for the rivers that start in Westborough. I would actually say that the first thing to do is there is some testing procedures you can do to determine what's the cause. And that's going to drive a lot of what's going on here. And yeah, I mean, if it's because of the agricultural stuff, we'd probably have to go to the state and possibly the state legislature to get something to say, hey, wait a minute, this lease is damaging.
Right.
And if it's the old sewer, it would definitely be, they'd have to do some major
Yeah.
But it really depends until you know what's going on. But that first one may mean that you can do it a lot quicker or slower. But if you put the first one up, say, at least study the, do an initial study and identify the cause, not just the, oh, it's nutrients of some sort. But.
How far did the current study go? Because we did a study like 2 years ago. Do you know?
I don't know what the study said.
Okay, I've been trying to find it, and I haven't found it. But we did a study like 2 years ago.
Contact the Conservation Department.
Okay.
And that maybe it did get more detail, but if that's the case, then obviously you can break it down into time. But if not, we need something that says who's providing the nutrient load, and that can be done through our.
Yeah, okay. So I think there's sort of some agreement from here. I just want to be the time watcher for this. I mean, I think we're starting breaking it down into different pieces.
Trying to say, can you move that up into one of these? I think that's what you're
Yeah, that's what we're saying, move it up to one of them. We'll figure out where exactly where it goes, but yeah.
I'd say at least move up the investigation so we know whether or not it's money the town has to spend or what money do we have to go beat up the state. And those are.
I mean, this is a good time of the year to go to the colleges and ask them, WTI is always looking for projects for the kids to do, and to study the water contamination is right up their alley.
All right, let me keep us going, stay on time. So the next one is the regulatory piece. That's maybe one of the most freestanding of these things. Doesn't, it's not relied on other things. But it's also, again, one of the areas that potentially has some low-hanging fruit, and it's pretty simple. Planners like stealing from each other, and there's lots of good models that are out there. So if the town wanted to do this, and if there was consensus, first for planning board, it then has to go before town meeting, so none of these things are incredibly easy, but not especially difficult in the grand scheme of things. Comments on that one, the regulatory one? All right, so then the management piece, this is the one that could potentially be, it sounds pretty simple, figure out the management, but potentially you could be looking at, for both that and the next one, you could be looking at needing more money, and we know that the questions that need more money are always the ones that are really difficult and take lots of years of discussion. So that's why we said, it's an important item, but it's not going to happen fast. It takes a lot of work to sort of build consensus.
Well, the tracking the tasks I'm excited about.
What-
She made that wonderful model of all the DPW stuff that's going on in town. If she could do that with this kind of stuff, that would be really useful to be able to, because it's a real easy way to look and see what's changing, what's happening. And she's got a structure and everything set up, times and stuff.
Okay, good.
Just a working Excel spreadsheet for,
Yeah, so if
Okay.
she could do that same thing for this, for the tracking the tasks, that would be nice.
Good, thank you.
Are you on priority 7?
Yes. Yep. Do you have more comments on that one? So next one is the recreation offerings. These are, longer term building consensus. So this is sort of, community centers done, whatever that entails. What's the next step further down in the process? Golf manager is independent of you or semi-independent? Okay, okay. So, same thing. I know that, some of these conversations, some of what we're documenting is things that are already happening. Lots of conversations at the golf club. But any comments on this one? I know in the survey, incidentally, we did hear lots of comments about wanting more recreation opportunities. Pretty common. You're a younger town than many towns, and lots of people want recreation for their kids. All right, so the next one we had was the ADA, the lower priority items. These are the ones that are much further out. And then, like Chauncey, I think whether we leave it here as a place marker for longer term or say, if we're moving the feasibility part up, you don't know where the feasibility is going to come. It's not really a recreation or conservation funded item. So we're highlighting it here because it obviously has a big effect on recreation, but you tend not to fund these things with recreation grants or open space grants that cuts across other departments for the process.
Why does it say staff and stormwater utility?
So one of the things we said is, if you ever wanted to, this is a much longer term thing. Some communities have set up a stormwater utility. It's never enough money in the process. Charge a fee based on an impervious area. Oh, you do have that? Okay. Okay, so I guess I didn't realize that. Okay. So that's a potential funding mechanism for that sort of process. To the extent, this goes back to the feasibility study, to the extent that the problem is stormwater as opposed to historical sewage or some, or nutrients. But okay, sorry about that. Well, I think I must have known that when I wrote this. I just forgot it. And if you're like most towns, you probably have so many things that were deferred that there's not a lot of freedom in the budget for a while until you make up for, deferred maintenance. But all right, that's sort of my list. Am I leaving out? And it's often easier to look at a list that's before you and not, like Don started us with thinking about things that weren't even on the list. Are there any other things that aren't even on the list you want?
I'd like to get some clarification, Robin, like pointed out, on priority 6, goal number 1, saying that regulatory zoning and wetlands regulatory changes to encourage and rationalize conservation. I am not sure what the heck that means at all.
So it could be any one of a number of things. So one that I mentioned is an incentive for open space donations, where you still get credit for it. That could be a zoning change, for example. One for wetlands is, I think, it's again been a while since I read your bylaws, but I think you have the same setbacks everywhere in town. Some places say maybe not everywhere is the same. I'm not advocating this, but it's sort of you could look at. Some places say, well, maybe it's a pristine area and you want no development within 200 feet or 300 feet of a vernal pool, and maybe a degraded wetland somewhere else. You still have to follow the state statute, but you don't necessarily need anything beyond it.
Case at all. We have a variable setback, 20 feet minimum, up to 50, depending upon the quality of the wetlands. We also have more protection for vernal pools. So there is a table in the
Good. Okay.
regulations that explains all the different setbacks
Okay.
that we do have in our regulations.
Good, okay. So maybe you're there, I know you're not for the zoning part, but those are the sorts of things you look at. You think about that. Is that still the right piece, re-examining it? Then maybe that's not one that needs tinkering, but.
In the same zone, the thing about stewardship,
Which one you want?
CLT, things about stewardship, if you're talking about trails at least, WCLT recently has been hearing more and more. Well, I told the town about this problem, and we never hear about it, even though we're the stewards of the trails. And so therefore, and I've heard the community development director say, you guys are doing a crappy job. Well, it turns out that the ones that he was complaining about are all things that were reported to the town and never turned over to WCLT, even though the 25 years ago, last March, the Board of Selectmen accepted an agreement that said that the WCLT were the trail stewards for the town. So they're ignoring a legal agreement. I mean for all the walking trails in town. All the walking trails in town. Yes. And they've ignored it, except when they wanted us to adopt the new blazes, which they had already bought, and then told us, oh, well, they cost this, which was about 5 times what we were paying for blazes. So we decided, we gently told them, no way in hell.
So again, that's why I want to do a plan sort of going forward, not reopening things.
So is that kind of going in line with talking with other organizations? It's a better connection between WCLT and the town, maybe as part of goal 4?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's part of the whole thing.
Yeah, so maybe that's where we should highlight that. Like maybe there's just a clear process, so people, when they get a call, they know, oh, I need to put it on this list and hand it over to this person.
Again, we're not going to go into that level of detail. The action item is setting up an annual meeting. That's really the important, and then Don, whoever else raises it at that point.
Yeah, but I think maybe we can call out specifically that we need to have connection with WCLT since they're
Oh, yeah, that's in, yeah. And this, just to be clear, what you're seeing here is a summary of the plans. All right, any last thoughts before I let you all go?
I'd just like to say, as someone with a hearing concern, and I do have hearing aids, the echo in this place is horrible. I've only been able to pick up about a third of the words that people have been saying. I see others are having issues as well. The town needs to try to do something to this building, this room, or de-exit, put another ceiling in it or something. I don't know what the answer is. I'm sure it's not simple, but it really makes me not want to come to these meetings because I can only capture, the handouts were really helpful. And I think without the handouts, I'd have just walked. And I appreciate what everybody's doing, but this room stinks.
Thank you. Okay. You get the last comment then. So thank you all for coming. This is really helpful in the process.
Sorry if I stuck my nose.